A lot of times Islamic economics is thought in terms of economic law, Islamic economic law, and that's really not an adequate way to think of Islamic economics, because although Islamic economic law, such as the prohibition against riba and prohibition against risk trading and so forth and so on, set the conditions for economic activity in an Islamic economy, they really don't explain how it is. You know, when we were discussing last session the whole idea of Islamic science, that there is such a thing as, for example, an Islamic approach to mathematics, which changes our understanding of physics, which implies all kinds of things for astronomy and all of the other sciences. And that includes medicine, that there is such a thing as Islamic medicine, not just Muslims who do medicine, although there's a lot of Muslim physicians who practice allopathic or modern Western medicine. But there's a very big difference between Islamic medicine, which is holistic, in the same way that we talked about the qualitative and quantitative aspects of things before, and a kind of reductionist approach to medicine, or allopathic medicine, that looks at the body as a machine. And so that's a kind of mechanistic approach. And so in the same way that oftentimes Western medicine attempts to basically treat symptoms instead of dealing with root causes, traditional Islamic medicine is holistic in its view of health and disease and focuses on the root cause of disease. Now, modern allopathic medicine, in the same way it focuses on the treatment of symptoms, likewise, modern economics and its related financial system are often content with finding remedies to cure what seems to be the mere symptoms of its recurring disease. So if we take this basis that we say, look, there is such a thing as Islamic science, not just Muslims who practice secular science, but add Islamic ethics to it, that there is actually an Islamic approach to science that deals with the root causes of issues, because it's based on a holistic approach. In the same way, there's going to be such a thing as Islamic economics that deals with the root causes of our economic problems. And those root causes are not simply a question of, poor morals and applying this powerful technology in an immoral way. It really goes much deeper than that, because it has something to do with the worldview that we talked about before. It has to do with this scientism. So what I'd like to suggest is that our current economic problems, whether they're environmental economic problems or problems of economic instability and so forth, are really the result of a mechanistic and materialist worldview that generates these various scientific, technological, political, economic, and other social structures that do violence to both man and nature. And those structural injustices in turn generate patterns of economic instability and environmental degradation. So specific crisis events really are just the tip of the iceberg. They're the tip of the iceberg because any crisis economic event that we see is really part of an underlying pattern beneath the surface of the water that it's manifesting. And that pattern is generated by our flawed underlying economic and technological structures and scientific structures, which are in turn generated by our truncated worldview that we just spoke about in the previous session, which is why I thought it would be appropriate that we discuss religion and science before we talk about Islamic economics. Now, Mir Finderisky is a wonderful, wonderful classical scholar who we can draw on to help us think about these types of issues. Mir Finderisky was late 16th century, early 17th century Muslim philosopher. Some say he was one of the teachers of Mullah Sadra, and he wrote this very, very important book on the classifications of the various sciences and professions. And he said that for a society to be economically healthy, it has to have a worldview that is based on a prophetic model. He organized the classification of professions that, though in terms of at the very top of the hierarchy being the prophets, who bring with them both knowledge and practice that is universal, that all of us can apply to generate good economic and other structures that generate good patterns, that generate good events, good outcomes. And so this would be a model or economy based on Tawheed. And so it generates health. On the other hand, there are the opposite of the prophets. You know, if we have the awliya Allah on one hand, in the case of the prophets, we have, for example, on the other extreme, on the other end, we have atheists, we have those who are materialists, we have those who deny the afterlife, and so forth. And then there are the awliya shaitan. There's another class. And so those would be the opposite of the prophets. And they would in turn set in a worldview which would generate structures that would be based on takfir, in a sense based on shirk, absolutizing something else other than Allah. Because whatever it is that we always are going to absolutize something, even if it's our own egos. So it's based on, this other alternative is based on shirk. And this leads to all kinds of dysfunction in society, economic dysfunction, and social, political crises, all kinds of problems. So we have a holistic model based on Tawheed on one hand versus a takfir model that's based on, you might say, shirk on the other. But the root cause of the economic ailments is obviously going to be in that worldview. And Mir Finderisky brings this out very, very beautiful in his book on the different professions. And he defines those professions in a way that is not simply related to the division of labor you might have, for example, making a particular product, but in terms of an intellectual division of labor as well. So that would include the various sciences. So Mir Finderisky is, you might say, in a sense, this kind of one-stop shopping for a true Islamic approach to economics that gets into all these ideas of health, on one hand, relating medical and economic health to each other, relating the hierarchy of knowledge, relating the prophetic approach versus the kind of takfiri approach, and so forth and so on. It really is kind of related to the discussion that we had before of that which is symbolic versus that which is diabolic. Now, unfortunately, modern economic theory does not look at economics in that way. Modern economic theory is based on the idea that modern society is made up of these two spheres, that there's an economic sphere of individual initiative and interaction that's governed by impersonal laws that assure a beneficent outcome through the pursuit of self-interest. And then there's the rest of social life, including political, religious, and moral interactions that require the conscious balancing of self-interest with social considerations. So you see how there are these two spheres that are very different. In one sphere, economics says that the economic sphere is one in which ethics are really irrelevant to outcomes. Whereas in the other rest of social life, including political and religious, social, moral interactions, that ethics do make a difference. Is that clear to everybody? Does that distinction make sense, first of all, before we proceed?
That is between the modern and the traditional, you said.
Pardon me?
You're contrasting the modern and the traditional.
Right. But it's not only, now the modern and traditional is the traditional says there is no economic sphere that is independent or separate from an ethical sphere that requires the conscious balancing of self-interest with social considerations. So in other words, the traditional approach to economics denies that economics has a separate sphere, whereas the modern approach to economics says that ethics is irrelevant. Let me give you an example. When a mother goes to buy milk for her family, does she have the interest of the grocer or the milk seller in her mind when she is making that interaction, when she is buying that milk? Or should she care about the grocer or the seller of the milk when she is buying the milk?
No.
Does that distinction make sense? All right, I see Sarah says yes, that she should care. And that would be the traditional response.
Oh.
The traditional response is that yes, both sides should care about each other in the exchange, in the transaction. That is correct from a traditional point of view. But from the modern economic point of view, what they are saying is that actually it doesn't matter whether the person who's buying the milk is a mother who cares not only for her baby but also for the interests of the grocer or the person who's selling the milk, or a miser who just happens to like milk and just wants to get the best deal possible from the seller of the milk or the grocer. In either case, they're going to be getting the same price. And therefore, ethics, whatever the ultimate end is in the transaction, is irrelevant to the transaction. Does that distinction make sense?
Yes.
But I thought it's the
all right, here you go. So, economists are saying that in certain transactions, the ultimate end of the person in the transaction can be either tuistic, which means, from tuism, like two, that I care for the other person, that there's reciprocity, that the grocer or the milk seller cares about the family and about the baby, or whether it's an impersonal exchange, that the grocer or milk seller really doesn't care about the other party, and vice versa. So in modern economic theory, what they are arguing is that the ultimate motivation is irrelevant to the economic transaction. Now that is a very, very dangerous idea because, and it's partly right in the sense that, yes, in many cases, whether the person cares about the other or not, it may appear to be observationally equivalent in the transaction itself. But there are cases in which it is clearly not observationally equivalent, and those cases occur before we get into exchange processes, namely in the production processes. So, for example, Adam Smith himself said that when he came to talk about the assembly law, And I'll just quote Adam Smith here to bring up, yes. He says, in the progress of the division of labor, and remember, Adam Smith talks about the division of labor in the pin factory, where he says that if you have each person doing just one thing all the time, that will increase the efficiency of and productivity of the pin factory. So what he has, and in his first edition of The Wealth of Nations, he talks about the beneficial effects of the division of labor. But in the second edition, he puts in the following paragraph that shows that he starts to have some reservations about the division of labor, and he says the following. He says, in the progress of the division of labor, the employment of the far greater part of those who live by labor, that is, of the great body of the people, comes to be confined to a few very simple operations, frequently to one or two. But the understandings of the greater part of men are necessarily formed by their ordinary employments. The man whose whole life is spent in performing a few simple operations, of which the effects are perhaps always the same or very nearly the same, has no occasion to exert his understanding or to exercise his invention in finding out expedients for removing difficulties which never occur. He naturally loses, therefore, the habit of such exertion and generally becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. The torpor of his mind renders him not only incapable of relishing or bearing a part in any rational conversation, but of conceiving any generous, noble, or tender sentiment, and consequently of forming any just judgment concerning many even of the ordinary duties of private life. In other words, if we're stuck on the factory line all the time, the assembly line, so to speak, then we're going to lose our faculties, human faculties. We're going to stultify our abilities to fulfill our true potential. And so this is what is called, what some economists continue. All right. And so basically, there are certain markets that are what you might call degrading markets. In other words, there are certain types of markets that devalue what it is that is the good in question, that it should be valued in a higher way than it is in the market. So, for example, we could sell, bid to the highest bidder seats at a university, but that would compromise the integrity of the university. Did everybody have a chance to read the article that I sent, the link to that article, the Zaytuna article, by any chance?
People here haven't read, the 4 students here haven't read it.
Have not read. All right, no problem. So I will just kind of maybe just summarize some of those points very quickly. And basically, the idea in that article is that there are, and Michael Sandel and other philosophers have written a great deal about this. He's a Harvard philosopher, one of the leading philosophers. He basically states that that there are some types of markets in which the goods. Did you go to Adam Smith? I'm sorry. I'm just looking at a message. The article of Adam Smith, did it mean that division of labor demeans people's faculties? Yes, absolutely. That's what it meant. It means that it demeans people's faculties, that our abilities are stunted. And really, there are, you might say, 3 objectives of work from the Islamic point of view that also Schumacher points out and many others have pointed out. First is to produce necessary and useful goods and services. So that's very important. The second is to develop our God-given faculties like good stewards. And the third is to cooperate with one another and serve one another in order to break down our egocentricity. So in other words, to free ourselves from our nefs al-ammar. Now, anytime, the first objective of work is what philosophers call transitive. In other words, it affects something outside of ourselves. When we produce necessary and useful goods and services, we're doing something that affects something outside of ourselves. But those second and third objectives are intransitive. In other words, they remain within us. And so when Adam Smith talks about that division of labor demeaning people, he's really talking about one of the intransitive effects of work, that work can either elevate our nature or corrupt our nature. And so in the case of this, is clearly demeaning our faculties. In the same way, there are certain types of exchange processes that are demeaning to the human person. First of all, there are certain types of goods that can never be even exchanged or sold, like love or friendship. If we try to buy friendship, obviously that's not real friendship to begin with. We might be able to hire somebody to do the same things that a friend would do, but that's not a real friend. A real friend is somebody who cares about us and we care about them, and therefore there's no market exchange, so to speak, going on there. And so there are certain types of goods that cannot be exchanged without turning them into counterfeits, like love, friendship, and so forth. But there are other types of goods which can be exchanged, but the question is whether or not they should be exchanged. So for example, kidneys. We have 2 kidneys. We can survive without one of them. And unfortunately, there's this vast market for kidneys. Sometimes people, I know in India, there's a very large market in this regard that, sometimes people get into debt and therefore to pay off their debt, they'll sell one of their kidneys. Now, this is a market in which the kidney is still functional, so that there is the good. It hasn't disappeared in the same way that love or friendship has by the exchange. But the question is whether or not something like kidneys should be exchanged. And at least the scholars at Al-Azhar have ruled against it. Some of the Shiite fuqaha have said that it's permissible, and so there's a legal debate about some of these types of questions. But nevertheless, it's a very important question to ask. Now, the question here that we come to is that in these production processes, should somebody subject themselves to the assembly lines of production? And is that dehumanization that occurs on the assembly line something that we should allow in the same way that we would allow the selling of kidneys or anything else? Now, according to Mirfin Rizki and all of the other scholars in our Torah, they would say absolutely not. They would say that those types of production processes are inhumane, and therefore, if the production process is inhumane, then any exchange process that's based on that production process will also be unacceptable. So if ethics matters in the production process, then it's going to matter in the exchange process. Does everybody see that connection? Is that clear to everybody? All right, very good. So I'm sorry, I saw a hand go up. What was that?
Raising is that because the whole process of mass production is based on the assembly line, so how can Adam Smith then say that there are problems, ethical problems with the assembly line?
Yes, you're right. He started to have second thoughts about it in the second edition. But what Adam Smith said is that he said that what the government has to do is have people learn poetry and do other things after work to restore their humanity. Now, of course, that's not going to work. And John Ruskin said that was the most ridiculous idea. He was a critic of Adam Smith and all of these classical economists. He said if a person is on the assembly line all day, they're going to lose their minds basically. How are they possibly going to read poetry and bring things back into life? So this is very much related to our previous discussion about the spiritual significance, for example, of numbers, and how that leads to the spiritual significance of the arts and the crafts and architecture based on sacred geometry, sacred mathematics, and so forth and so on. So if there is a spiritual meaning in the production processes that are based on the spiritual meanings of the sciences that Mir Finderisky talked about in his classification of the sciences, then that is what's going to be necessary to humanize the work, to make the work into a holistic production process that is sustainable, that is in harmony with nature, and is in harmony with ourselves and with others. And therefore, if we have production processes that are based on this type of holistic approach, then naturally the producer is going to care about the consumer. And a producer is also a consumer. It's not like, you know, a producer is also a consumer, or it's not just one way or the other. There's nobody who's only a producer or who's only a consumer. Everybody is producing or consuming something, even if they're not necessarily being paid for it in the market system. Everybody is doing certain activities, and if those activities have a spiritual meaning to it, then as producers, when we come to the market to exchange goods, then we will also be caring about one another mutually. But the key to it is the spiritual significance of the production processes. Once the spiritual significance of production processes is lost, then the spiritual significance of the exchange process is also lost. And then the economist's argument about the irrelevance of ethics in the exchange processes start to have a bite to it. It has a bite to it. And in other words, it starts to have some reality to it. But if the production processes are spiritually meaningful, then the economists are completely wrong that that everything is just going to be observationally equivalent, because it will have transformed the production processes, which transform the exchange processes. Now, on top of that,
if we take this thought a step further, isn't it also true within Islamic thought that any act that you do as part of your work or your profession, if it is done with a spiritual intent, as if it is being done in accordance with the will of God, then it also becomes ibadah?
That's right. Now, here's the thing. There's two issues here. One issue is what we do individually within a given economic system. Let's say, for example, we don't have the option of transforming production processes into a holistic, approach, because we have a given economic system that is already established within which we have to operate. So we as individuals, you're absolutely right. However, there are three criteria. The first criterion is that the things that we are making are necessary and not like super luxury items. So for example, the good has to correspond to some necessity. It's not like making a golden, a golden bath for Donald Trump or something like that. Obviously that's not a necessity. So, I'm sure Donald Trump is probably changing all the White House toilet fixtures to, make it all gold, like he has in place. But, so number one, it should correspond to a necessity, because anything that's a necessity, and I don't mean just bare necessities of life, because we can also have things that beautify life that correspond to a spiritual necessity. So it's not just having the bare necessities. or being, you know, complete ascetics or something like that. No, we have a hierarchy of the daruriyat and the hajiyat and tahsiniyat and so forth and so on. So there are things that beautify life, but not going to like the super luxury excess of, for example, somebody who's making yachts for, you know, billionaires or something like that. That does not correspond to a necessity. So it should be something that, whereas making fishing boats or other things, you know, does correspond to a necessity. So long as one's profession is dealing with a necessity of some type, then that is a form of ibadah, or with other conditions is a form of ibadah. The second condition is that one is, of course, dedicating that work to Allah. And the third is that one tries to accomplish it as perfectly as possible, because, of course, Allah, we can't just, you know, He deserves the best, and so we should strive our best to give Him the best that we can. And so that is an element of duty that comes out in what we're trying to provide. So given those circumstances at the individual level, working within a given system, yes, that is a form of ibadah for the individual. However, collectively, we are operating in a system that we would like to transform, because collectively what is happening is that the system is based on these kind of secular sciences that deny the qualitative dimension of things, starting from the arithmetic, starting from all of that sacred versus secular science that we started talking about in the first session, to deprive work of its spiritual meaning collectively. So it would be so much more beautiful if all of our professions could be re-sacralized, that instead of our professions, you know, having these various constraints of, you know, this kind of mass production and mass distribution, which is ultimately destroying the environment, which is ultimately, for many of us, not providing us spiritually meaningful work, and therefore, for many people, because they don't have the spiritually meaningful work, what it instills in them is a thirst for more goods quantitatively. In other words, it's like drinking salt water. It's devouring the environment more and more. And that's really a huge problem here in the United States and in the West in general, where most people are unfortunately spiritually lost, and therefore they are kind of searching for the finite, for the infinite in the finite, and we need to restore these sacred sciences and sacred approaches to production to the whole society. That is what Mir Finderisky was talking about when he talked about the division of labor and the division of understanding in the sciences, and that we have to use prophetic knowledge in order to establish our economy that would make our work spiritually meaningful and would satisfy us inwardly and create a caring environment, a caring community, that we are truly a community, that we care for one another, instead of this type of, you know, exchange and production that is just so vast and widespread that we have no connection. It's completely impersonal, and it's leaving a huge economic footprint that's going to lead to a collective suicide. So this is the difference between the holistic production processes based on Tawheed versus the profane or secular productions processes based on Takfir. And where modern economic theory goes wrong is that it says that, you know, these things don't matter, the ethical aspect doesn't matter at all, that it's irrelevant, and because it's irrelevant, it's unnecessary to produce good outcomes. And both of those assertions are incorrect. It is a mistake of economists to make that argument, because they're assuming that the production processes are spiritually neutral. which they're not. And so they, by assuming the production processes are spiritually neutral, then they assume that the exchange processes can serve any end, and that in the ultimate consequences for society are going to be good, regardless of whether somebody cares about the other person in the exchange or not. And so it all goes back to the production processes, which go back to the sciences and technology, which goes back to our discussion of the relationship between religion and science. And the wonderful thing about Mir Finderisky is that he has it all, in a sense. Of course, he was writing before Adam Smith, and he didn't articulate this separate domain argument that ethics would be irrelevant to economics, but in a sense, you can extrapolate from what Mir Finderisky said to that, because he was basically saying that for every class or approach, holistic approach to something, there's an anti-holistic approach or a mechanistic approach to that that is the opposite of the one, you know, the holistic, and therefore it's based on takdir and so forth. And by virtue of that will lead to disequilibrium and lack of health, economic, political, social health, and so on.
जो ये स्पिरिचुअल वो लेके आना चाहते हैं, क्या इस सिस्टम के अंदर हम स्पिरिचुअल डाल दें तो सिस्टम बेहतर हो जाएगी? तो मतलब अभी जो एग्जिस्टिंग इकोनॉमिक सिस्टम है ये तो अपनी पूरी एसेंस में ही खराब है ना। इसमें आप स्पिरिचुअलिटी भी डाल दें तब भी ये जाएगी तो उसी तरह बाद में, क्योंकि ये है ही एक इसकी नीड मास प्रोडक्शन होती है, तो उसको कंट्रोल करने का स्पिरिचुअल में वो क्या चीज़ है जिसको मतलब इस पूरे प्रोसेस को सही कैसे किया जा सकता है?
Definitely, Danish is asking that because this particular system is based on very different foundations, so even if we added the spiritual element, will that really change anything? And then otherwise, what do we need to do?
Yeah, no, we need to change the whole system. You're right. We can't just do something like add little pieces. The whole system has to be completely changed from the ground up, and unfortunately it's going to take Isa alayhi salam to do it. I mean, when he returns, it's not going to be, you know, changes on the margins. Like, you and I can do things individually on our own. For example, we can approach things, you know, there's holistic medicine and integrative medicine and so forth, and there are physicians who are trying to do that. I know Muslim physicians here in the United States, they're sick and tired of the medical system here because they feel like they can't be true healers. The insurance companies, they want to talk to their patient. The physicians, the Muslim physicians really want to talk to their patients to find out what's wrong with them. What are the issues, get to the root causes. And then they want to do their paperwork at 12 o'clock at night after they have a chance to talk to their patients. But the insurance companies are on top of them saying, no, you can't do that. We want you to do this. Insert the paperwork right away because we think you're wasting too much time with the patients. I mean, the whole system is bottled. It's awful. It's based on this mechanistic approach instead of a holistic approach, and that's why you know, things have got to change. So, but individuals can make individual changes on our own, and we can speak out against it. But to make a collective change, that's going to require a lot of these special interest groups and people to kind of come together, and there's a lot of interest groups who don't want to have any change. They don't even understand the need for change. They don't understand anything about any of the religion and science stuff that we talked about just before. How are we going to persuade them that numbers, that there is such a thing as sacred geometry, for example, or sacred arithmetic? Even at my university, which is a Jesuit Catholic university, you know, there's a big debate among colleagues about these kinds of issues, about to what extent should the religious universities be teaching traditional sciences, or do we want to go with the modern sciences, and so forth and so on. So if we have this debate even going on within secular universities, what is going to happen, you know, for the rest of our educational system? So we are in a deep intellectual and spiritual crisis, And the best that we can do is basically identify what it is that's wrong with it and speak what we believe is the truth. And inshallah, that at least understanding what's wrong with the system helps us, so we understand why it is that it's on the railroad track that it's going, and we try to save ourselves, our families, our friends, and then the rest is in Allah's hands. But the outlook looks very bleak. I mean, I'm sorry to kind of say that. I wish I could be more positive about it. But we have a president, Donald Trump, today said he's not willing to commit to the Paris Accord on the climate things. I mean, he'll think about it. Yeah, it's like that should take about less than a millisecond to think about. I mean, he should be approving that right away, because otherwise we're all dead. But it's these special interests. Really, we are the last generation that is enjoying a relatively good life. For the future generations, I feel very sorry for them. Because they... Yeah, I'm sorry. So, anyway, so Mir Finderisky had it right. I think that we need to very carefully, and he really clarified it when he said that this is really a system of good versus a system of evil. Right now, we have a system that's essentially evil. It degrades people in production, it degrades people in exchange. Yes, there are individuals who can kind of try to come forward, but unfortunately, even our economic theory, because it makes the separate domain argument, tries to rationalize in our minds to just remain content. Don't try to change the system because it is this separate domain in which the ethics are irrelevant to the outcomes. And therefore ethics are unnecessary. But that's a huge error. That is a huge error, and it's really, this is why economics is a very dangerous science. And it's not saying that economists themselves are evil. No, many economists, I mean, I have a master's degree in economics. I've talked to a lot of economists, and many of them are well-meaning people. So it's not that they mean, it's not like they're bad people or something, but they are often ignorant of these deeper philosophical issues. And they even think that their analytical tools are spiritually neutral, and that's a separate issue that I won't even get into, but it reinforces this argument. So the bottom line is that economists are, through this separate domain argument, are only able to address symptoms, not get to the root causes, and therefore they reinforce that worldview that doesn't want us to address the root causes, which is changing the worldview. And so, economics is a disastrous discipline. It's a you might say it's a bastard discipline in the sense that it has no pre-modern analog. In other words, there's a pre-modern analog to politics or political science. There's a pre-modern analog to just about every science. The only science in which there is no pre-modern analog is economics, because of the separation between ethics and economics. And so there's no, so it literally is a bastard science that is very dangerous, that is going to lead us to destruction by, kind of lulling us to sleep. And so that's why Mir Finderisky's work, I think, and other economists, it's not that he's an economist, but other philosophers like him, their work is so important to clarify these issues.
Wonderful. Can we now open it to discussion?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Anybody of our online participants, if they would like to add or ask anything?
I just wanted to ask that you said that Mir Finderisky had a typology in terms of the different ways in which the sciences, I think you were saying, are organized or should be organized. So if you could just dilate on that.
Yes, yes. He classifies them into 12 types of professions, you might say, or kind of categories of responsibilities, you might say. The first 6 are universal, and the second 6 are particular. And in the first 6, he would begin with the prophets, for example, who do talk about things that are universal and that are both theoretical as well as practical. And so that's a source of guidance for us. And then he talks about the opposite of those. And let me get out the following classification scheme. And there's a wonderful essay by Sayyid Hussein Nasr on this in the encyclopedia of this, what was it? History of Muslim Philosophy, that was edited by, it was earlier, let's see, just wait for me to see. It's available online, you can Google it and get the exact, yes, in M.M. Sharif's History of Islamic Philosophy, and it's if you go to ironicaonline.org, they have the whole breakdown there, and he says that, wait a minute. Yeah, I apologize, I'm not able to pull that up right now. But in any case, basically what he does is the following, is that he'll put them in various levels depending on which type of science that they are pursuing, whether it's practical or theoretical, or whether it's universal or particular. So let me go through and give you examples of the different categories. Let me just pull up the page numbers right now so I can go through this. All right, so on these different vocations, let me pull it up here. There's a nice graph that summarizes this. All right, so then he defines it in terms of subject, and then he talks about that the subject has a universal end or a particular end, and whether and that if the subject has a universal end and action follows, whether that's good or corrupt, that's one category. Whether the end is universal and knowledge results, and whether that knowledge is sound or corrupt, that's another 2 categories. Or if it's a universal end and both knowledge and action result, whether it's sound or corrupt, that's that completes the first 6. So where there's a universal end that results in both knowledge and action, and the knowledge is sound, that is the example of the prophets and the awliya Allah. But where there's a universal end and both knowledge and action, kind of results, but it's corrupt. In other words, it's the knowledge is corrupt and the action that follows is also corrupt. That's like the awliya shaitan. And then he goes into the next 6, where there's a particular end that's involved, where action follows, knowledge results, or both. And so where a particular end is involved, that could be either goodness or corruption, or the knowledge is good or corrupt, or both are ensue, and you have soundness or corruption. That establishes the the next 6 levels of the hierarchy. And so you could say where the subject is universal or general, and the end is both action as well as knowledge, from both of which there comes only goodness. That's the first category. The second is where the subject is universal and the end is both action as well as knowledge, from both of which there comes only corruption. The third is the subject is universal and the end is knowledge, whence there comes only goodness. The fourth is the subject is universal and the end is knowledge, whence there only comes corruption. Fifth, the subject is universal and the end is action, whence there only comes goodness. And sixth, the subject is universal and the end is action, whence there only comes corruption. So, for example, in the first and second would correspond, to those who are establishing the worldviews and the structures, and the same thing with the third and fourth, helping establish the worldview, but not dealing with the structures that are in place. And then the fifth and sixth deal with the structures, not so much the worldview. If we were going to use that, the kind of systems theory analogy that we used before. And so the third vocation, for example, those who pursue universal things, but it's just knowledge, would be, for example, the mutakallimun, or those who cultivate speculative philosophy, while the fourth represents, the opposite of them. So, for example, in the first category, we have the prophets, and so forth. In the second category, you have those who are opposing the prophets. In the third category, you have those who are the theologians and who enrich and cultivate speculative philosophy. In the fourth category, those are going to be the ones who are opposing the theologians, who are pursuing, who are displaying the right knowledge. The fifth category is made up of the fuqaha, because they're cultivating practical philosophy, while the sixth category is composed of their opposites. So, for example, in the sixth category, that would be the basis of our legal system today. The fuqaha, when in Islam, a lot of it is based on the maqasid al-sharia. The fuqaha has the fiqh, or the Islamic law has a variety of levels to it, as I'm sure you all will be studying in your class, in your classes. One of them is the issue of the maqasid al-sharia. That's at the highest level. And then you have usul al-fiqh, and then you have just the specific fiqh cases, and you have these three different levels that one is working on. And so those who are operating on the level of the maqasid al-sharia would be working on the level of natural law theory, that things, for example, have a telos, things have a purpose to them, and therefore we shouldn't violate that. So the fuqaha would say, all right, there's no homosexual marriage, for example. That's out of the question. Whereas here, they would say any natural law argument that is brought into court is automatically thrown out. Natural law argument is based on the idea that something has a nature that has to fulfill its potential, and the potential is based on an essence in the mind of Allah, for example. Any U.S. court in which a natural law argument like that is brought up, that lawyer will be expelled from practicing law. They will be thrown out of the law profession. You're not allowed to bring any of those arguments. So modern law, secular law, what they call positive law, not positive in the sense that it's good, but that whatever the law is positive. It's positive. There it is. That would be an example of the opposite of the fifth category. Our fifth category would be fuqaha. The current judges and lawyers in the United States would be in the sixth category because they are opposing natural law arguments. It didn't always used to be this way in the West, but it is this way today, unfortunately. So you see how those different things, and all of this is based on going back to those first and second categories. Because if we get off on the wrong track, if we go with the first category and we stick with the prophet, and the prophets, and go with theirs, and then we will build with the third category, with the mutakallimun and so forth, and then the fuqaha with the fifth category. But on the other hand, if we go with the worldview based on takfir, with those who oppose the prophets, then we'll go with those who are also opposing the mutakallimun, these kind of, basically almost sophists, who are bringing up all these, you could even call them postmodernists. Let's call them postmodernists in the modern category. They would be postmodernists. And then you would deal with the modern legal profession. So those would be examples of the first 6 categories. And you see how one is based on it's holistic and based on tawheed, and the other is basically based on an atheistic, materialistic worldview that's based on takfir. And so when it comes into the other categories, you have, for example, these vocations are focused on particular professionals and specific sciences. So, for example, this would be like the physician or machinist or operators, craftsman or engineer. And the 8th would be their opposite, those who misuse those vocations. And the ninth includes people who have only a theoretical knowledge of their particular vocation and science. They might know it theoretically, like music, medicine, or so forth. They have theoretical knowledge, but not practical knowledge of a particular vocation, whereas the 10th would be the opposite of the 9th. And then the 11th and 12th are basically catch-all for any other professions that are left. And so basically what we have here in all of these categorizations is that all of the good categorizations, whether they're on the universal or particular end, or whether it results in action or knowledge, if it's good, it's based on the holistic prophetic model. If it's bad, it's based on this secular materialist mechanistic model, we might say. And so, just to move to the categories again, once again, it's based on Tawheed versus Takfir.
Yes, I did. It goes back to, this question about modern economics, and when you talk about productivity. And, one of the elements in that reading material that we had was that it takes away this assembly line production element takes away from the dignity of man. And if we had a spiritual element, or if the person was allowed to develop his full potential, you're obviously repositing that dignity back to the person. But within the modern economic paradigms, there are elements where people have addressed this question of productivity and what makes for a happy worker, who is producing something. And there, of course, there is no spirituality involved. They have come up with the idea that if you give the person a sense of ownership in what they're doing, or if you give them a sense of some kind of buy-in into the whole process. For example, by giving them an incentive in terms of what they earn, then that makes for happier and better. So there is some element of, it may, I don't know what it does to to the dignity element of the person, but it certainly leads to happier and more productive workers who have a buy-in, who are not necessarily just robots who are performing something mechanistically.
Right. Yes, this whole idea of economic democracy, for example, that instead of having shareholders, you would have the workers being the shareholders and so forth.
Exactly. Like the Japanese did in their car industry.
Right.
The guy who's on the assembly, he has sense of pride that he's producing a good Toyota.
Yeah. No, unfortunately, Japan has like extremely high suicide rates and they've lost their
Yes.
No, I know what you mean. I understand what you're saying. I understand what you're saying. The thing is that those, and I know that those types of studies have been done, and E.F. Schumacher and others have really written, I think, some very beautiful work on that. I think the best book, I think, on this subject, on the philosophy of work and what could be spiritually meaningful and give true satisfaction in the long term, is a book by John Hughes called The End of Work. And you don't have to read the whole book, obviously, if you're interested in this, but there are certain chapters in there that really kind of survey this whole question of the philosophy of work and what's involved and what brings real meaning to it. And unfortunately, no matter how much a stake somebody has in something, if the production process is basically a secular production process, it's not going to have the same spiritual meaning than a person who can approach it in a more holistic way. So, for example, let's just take this as an example. My friend who's a physician here, I have several friends who are physicians here. You'd think, and they have their own practices. It's not like they're employees of somebody else. They have their own practices here, and they are really kind of fed up with the system because they feel like they can't be healers anymore. They want to really deal with their patients in a different way, and they themselves, by the way, don't go to other allopathic doctors. They go to those who know integrative medicine. There's a physician here who's become very famous in Ohio, and a lot of people have gone up to her in Cleveland. I forget her name at the moment, but she had a form of sclerosis, and somehow she practiced more holistic medicine, and it was like some miraculous thing. And because she herself is a physician and she knows how to explain it to other physicians, there's like all these other physicians are just fascinated and going to her and seeing what her story is all about. And even these idea of integrative cancer centers where they're trying to combine holistic medicine with allopathic medicine to treat their patients and so forth. So these things are kind of coming up more and more, and there's a thirst even among physicians themselves. And physicians here in the United States are usually, talk about 9 of the top 10 paying positions jobs in the United States are in the medical field. So number one, they're making a lot of money, and number two, they're often their own practices, and number three, the question is whether they're happy or not. I mean, if anybody could be happy in that position, you'd think that they would, but there's a thirst among many of them, and some of them are from India and Pakistan, and they're more sensitive to these issues. They're more sensitive to this kind of holistic approach. And unfortunately, some of their American colleagues who are not as spiritually as sensitive or caring just want to make as much money as possible. I mean, with the Hippocratic Oath at the bottom line, it should have read, I also promise to make as much money as I can. That's literally, seriously, their idea of the good life is just to make as much money as they possibly can. And of course, we know that that's a mirage. Because like the Prophet ﷺ said, you give the son of Adam one valley of gold, and then, you know, he's going to want another. So these guys who are down that rabbit hole will want to make, you know, their first $1 million, and then after that, all right, what's next? Let's make another $1 million. And their families may be falling apart, and then they come to the imam who's making much less than they are and is much happier than they are, and, you know, for help to deal with all of these other issues. So it's really, I understand what you're saying. It's better for somebody to have an economic stake in what they're doing. I agree with you. But that is not enough. We really have to re-sacralize our sciences to be satisfied, even intellectually. And, you know, even if we don't have the opportunity to put it into practice, at least for us to know it theoretically, even that would be fulfilling. And so I really believe that all of these physicians, just to take physicians as an example, would be extremely happy if they could integrate this holistic medicine with their current practice. They would be, and their patients would be so much happier as well.
Yeah, I agree with that, but you know, on the other hand, when we are talking about spirituality or just the materialistic element of things, you know, in the example that you were talking about, the woman, the mother who goes to buy milk for the child, whether that person has any thoughts of the milk cell. I would take the side. What do you think that the milk seller, do you think the milk seller has any consideration for the mother who's going there to buy the milk? You know, our country and in other Muslim countries and where people purportedly follow their spiritual teachings, milk sellers are amalgamators who are mixing water in the milk and selling it for